What if I told you there's a commander that turns every spell you cast from exile into a board-wide buff, generates you a huge amount of mana every time he swings, and despite being in one of Magic's priciest color combinations, you can build this entire deck for just €100. Fire Lord Zuko. Zuko might honestly be one of the most unique commanders we've seen in a long time, because his two abilities might pull in totally different directions on paper, but in practice they complement each other perfectly. For just 3 mana and Mardu colors, you get a solid 2/4 body with Firebending Axe, meaning that he will add red mana to our mana pool equal to his power whenever he attacks, and we get to keep that mana until the end of combat. And that ability alone already turns Zuko into a true tempo monster. Every time he attacks, he will add a huge burst of red mana to your mana pool you can immediately use to cast any instant speed spells or activate any activated ability. But Zuko's real power comes from his second ability. Whenever you cast any spell from exile, or whenever any permanent you control enters from exile, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on every creature you control, including Zuko himself. So every time you impulse draw, every time you blink a creature, and every time you drop a land from exile, Zuko will buff your entire board. And what makes Zuko truly absurd is how well the Mardu colors actually support him. Red gives us access to some of the strongest impulse card draw effects ever printed, white gives us access to blink effects and excellent protection, and black really balances everything out, giving us access to some premium removal and high value creatures. And the game plan for this deck is really simple yet very explosive. You'll want to play some early value creatures, follow up with Zuko, start casting spells from exile to put counters on every creature you control, and those counters will boost Zuko's firebending output, which will allow you to cast even more spells from exile and put even more counters on your creatures. This deck really is one giant feedback loop that will snowball out of control really quickly. Now there are a ton of different ways you can actually build Zuko. You could build a full firebending deck that tries to generate absurd amounts of mana. You could go all in on the blink strategy and build an entire deck focused on that, but none of those builds really focus on using both of Zuko's abilities at the same time. So for this deck I decided to go with a low curve, aggressive, synergy driven strategy that takes full advantage of everything that Zuko does. Going wide on the board, casting from exile, generating mana during combat, and using that mana to keep the engine running. And the best part is that this entire deck is built on a €100 budget, which honestly was one of the hardest challenges I faced with this deck, because Mardu is one of the most expensive color combinations to build in Commander. Even despite the price limit, this list is incredibly potent and a huge amount of fun to play. No tutors, no game changers, just a synergy-packed list that uses Zuko exactly the way he was designed. As I do in all my videos, I will be going over every single card in the deck and explaining why I decided to include it. And this video is divided up in 8 categories: the Exile Synergies, the Firebending Synergies, the +1/+1 Counter Synergies, Acceleration, the Support Cards, Protection and Interaction, the lands, and in the end I also have a lengthy upgrade section where I will be going over the cards you can include in the deck if you don't care about the €100 budget. And let's get started with the heart of the deck, the Exile Synergies. These are all the cards that allow us to cast spells from exile, blink our permanents, or repeatable exile engines that will generate us value every single turn. Every card in this section will make sure that we'll always have ways to trigger Zuko's last ability. Norin the Wary, one of the most iconic magic cards ever. A 1-mana legendary creature that will exile himself whenever any player casts a spell or any creature attacks, and he will return to the battlefield from exile at the end of the turn. Now Norin might seem like a really useless creature that just keeps disappearing and reappearing whenever something happens, but he's actually one of the strongest cards in this entire deck, because basically whenever any player does anything he will just blink himself, which whenever we do have Zuko on the battlefield will translate in all of our creatures getting a +1/+1 counter. And the amount of Zuko triggers that Norin will generate you is absolutely absolutely insane. You can just have Norin on the battlefield, follow up with playing Zuko, Norin will leave, he will enter, you will already get a Zuko trigger during your own turn. During an opponent's turn, if they cast any spell, he will blink himself again, get another Zuko trigger, and Norin will basically guarantee you 4 Zuko triggers every single turn cycle, which will grow all your creatures by a huge amount and will make Zuko's power go through the roof and enable you to generate a huge amount of mana with the Firebending. Grenzo, Havoc Razor. Whenever this 2-mana creature is on the battlefield and one of your creatures deals combat damage to a player, you get to choose one of 2 options. The first option allows you to goad a creature that player controls, meaning on the next turn that creature will have to attack if able, and it has to attack a player other than you. A nice little defensive option for whenever your opponents do have some huge creatures to just make sure they can't actually swing at you. And the second and most impactful option is that you get to exile the top card of that player's library and you get to cast it until the end of turn. Now obviously, since we are an aggressive deck and we will always be swinging with a huge amount of creatures, this card will generate you insane amounts of value, since you might actually hit some really relevant and potent spells that your opponents are playing in their decks, and they will grant you Zuko triggers whenever you play them. Inti, Seneschal of the Sun. Whenever you attack, you get the option to discard a card. When you do, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control, and it will gain trample until the end of turn. Now, discarding a card for just a simple +1/+1 counter is some horrible value, but it does synergize perfectly with Inti's second ability. Whenever you discard 1 or more cards, you get to exile the top card of your library and you are allowed to play that card until the end of turn, both making sure we don't lose any actual card advantage when discarding a card to his first ability and enabling us to play from exile and get those Zuko triggers. And his first ability is actually quite relevant in this deck. As you will see later in the video, we do play a ton of cards that synergize with +1/+1 counters. And the trample he gives is a really nice way for whenever you do have a high-powered Zuko to just ensure you can get commander damage through. And due to the way of how Inti's first ability is worded, you don't even have to attack with Inti himself. It will trigger whenever you attack with any creature you control. Party Treasure, a 2-mana lizard wizard. At the beginning of your first main phase, you get the option to discard a card. When you do, you get to exile the top 2 cards of your library. Then you get to choose one of those cards and you are allowed to play it until the end of turn. Non-creature spells you cast from exile have Convoke, meaning we can tap any of our creatures to help pay for the mana cost. And this effect is really potent in this type of deck because, as you will see later, we do run a ton of cards that will generate us creature tokens, which you can then use to cast any non-creature spell you exiled essentially for free. This will give you a Zuko trigger and put a +1/+1 counter on all of the tokens that you use to convoke that spell. And now that we're talking about generating tokens, Pia Nalar, Consul of Revival. Whenever we either play a land or cast a spell from exile with Pia on the battlefield, we get to generate a 1/1 flying Topter token. Now, as you can imagine, in this type of deck, it will be really easy to get those Pia triggers multiple times in a single turn, which will generate you a small army of flying Topter tokens. And whenever you then have Zuko on the battlefield, you will be able to stack a huge amount of +1 counters on those flying creature tokens and just take one of your opponents out of the game with them. And a really nifty trick you can do whenever you have both Zuko and Pia on the battlefield is actually decide how you want to stack your triggers. Whenever you cast a spell from exile, both Pia and Zuko will trigger. You can then choose to resolve the Pia trigger first, generate that 1/1 Topter token, then the Zuko trigger will resolve and the Topter will instantly get a +1/+1 counter. And passively, Pia also gives all Topters you control haste, which I suppose in some situations might actually be really relevant and enable you to instantly swing with your army of flying tokens at one of your opponents. Sinu, Keen-Eyed Protector, a 2-mana flying vigilance body, and you can tap Sinu to exile himself, gain 2 life, and scry 2. And the best part about Sinu is whenever a legendary creature you control attacks and isn't blocked, you get to put Sinu from exile onto the battlefield attacking. And since it does enter from exile, it will give you a free Zuko trigger even before the damage step. A really solid way to get some free Zuko triggers that will just keep coming back over and over again. Dream Devourer. This is just the perfect card for the deck because it really uses both of Zuko's abilities to their fullest. First up, it will give every non-land card in your hand the Foretell mechanic, meaning on instant speed for 2 generic mana you can exile those cards from your hand face face down. Then on any later turn you can cast them from exile for their foretell costs, which in this case will be their normal mana cost reduced by 2 generic mana. And this ability is just beyond crazy, because you can just swing with Zuko, add a huge amount of mana to your mana pool, use that mana to foretell like 3-4 cards from your hand, and then on a later turn you will be able to cast those cards from exile for a reduced cost, which will result in you getting a huge amount of triggers out of Zuko's second ability. It's honestly one of the best ways to use all of the mana that Zuko will generate you with is Firebending. And even though Dream Devourer would be removed from the battlefield, you will still be able to cast those cards you exiled. And they will retain the 2 mana cost reduction. So you won't ever lose any cards whenever you foretell them. And whenever you do decide to foretell a card, this creature will also get a +2 power boost until the end of turn. Anep, Vizier of Hazoret. Whenever this creature attacks, we get the option to exert it, meaning it won't untap on our next untap step. When we do, we get to exile the top 2 cards of our library and we are allowed to play those cards until the end of our next turn. And this until the end of the next turn part of the ability is actually really important, because you can just swing with them, exert them, exile those cards, and even though you don't have any mana available to play those cards this turn, they will still be available to cast from exile on your next turn whenever you do have the mana available. And since this creature does have trample, it is actually a really solid body to start stacking counters on with Zuko. Glimpse the Impossible. Whenever you cast this 3 mana sorcery card, you get to exile the top 3 cards of your library. You are then allowed to play those cards from exile until the end of the turn, and when you don't, these cards will just go to your graveyard, and for each card you didn't cast, you get to generate a 0/1 Eldrazi spawn token that you can sacrifice to add 1 colorless mana to your mana pool. You can use it to impulse draw and dig really deep into your deck, enabling you to cast from exile to get those Zuko triggers. You can use it to get some token bodies on the battlefield you can start stacking counters on with Zuko, and you can also use it as an acceleration spell, just sacrificing those tokens to generate you mana to just keep chaining spells from exile. Laelia, the Blade Reforged, a 3 mana haste creature that whenever it attacks allows you to exile the top card of your library and you are allowed to play it until the end of turn. And whenever any card is put into exile from either our library or our graveyard, we get to put a +1/+1 counter onto Laelia, a really aggressive creature that will ensure that we will always have something to cast from exile to get those Zuko triggers, and that will keep growing itself over the course of the game without ever even needing Zuko on the battlefield. Light up the stage. For 3 mana, you get to exile the top 2 cards of your library and you are able to play them until the end of your next turn. Some pretty solid value, but where this card goes from average to absolutely fantastic is due to the fact that it has the spectacle mechanic, meaning that whenever an opponent lost life this turn, you are actually able to cast it for just 1 red mana, making it into one of the most efficient impulse draw effects ever printed. Ryan Sinclair. Whenever this creature attacks, we get to exile the top cards of our library until we hit a non-land card. Then if the mana value of that spell is equal to or lower than Ryan Sinclair's power, we get to cast that spell from exile for free, giving us what is essentially a free spell cost and a free Zuko trigger. And thanks to Zuko, we will be able to stack a huge amount of counters onto this creature, grow its power, and we will be able to cast some of the biggest spells in our deck for absolutely free. Seize Opportunity. For 3 mana, we get an instant speed spell that will allow us to choose 1 out of 2 options. The first option is basically a light up the stage, allowing us to exile the top 2 cards and they will be available to cast until the end of our next turn. And the second option will give up to 2 creatures we control +2 power and +1 toughness until the end of turn. Now the main reason this card is included in the deck is because it is an instant speed spell and it is fantastic with Zuko's Firebending ability. You can just attack with your Zuko. If he is already at 3 power, you will get 3 mana added to your mana pool. You can use that mana to just cast a spell, and you will be able to either buff up your creatures or get some cards available to cast from exile on either this turn or the next turn. Tavern Brawler. For as long as this enchantment is on the battlefield, Zuko will get a new line of text. At the beginning of your upkeep, exile the top card of your library. Then Zuko will get +X max power equal to the mana cost of the exiled card. And it also enables us to play the exiled card until the end of the turn. A really solid enchantment that will enable us to cast from exile with Zuko and will allow us to dig one card deeper into our library every single turn. And the power boost that Zuko will get is actually really relevant in this deck because it will make sure that Zuko will generate you more mana with his Firebending. Kate Sith, Fortune Teller, a 4-mana creature that has a really similar ability to the previous card. The main differences being that Kate will trigger at the beginning of combat and not in your upkeep, and before actually exiling the top card of your deck you get to scry one first, meaning you actually get to manipulate the card you are about to exile. If you have a really good mana sink for Zuko's Firebending ability, you can just look at the top card of your library. If you see it's a land, just scry to the bottom, and you might just hit a really expensive card in this deck and you will get a huge amount of power boosted to Zuko. Decadent Dragon. This card has the adventure mechanic, meaning you can either cast it as a creature or you can cast the instant or sorcery part of this card first. The expensive taste part is a 3-mana instant speed spell that will allow you to exile the top 2 cards of target opponent's library. And for as long as those cards remain in exile, you are actually able to play them. A really nice way to ensure you will never miss a land drop by just playing your opponent's lands. You might actually hit some really valuable cards your opponents are playing in their deck with this effect. You will also get Zuko triggers by casting the exiled cards. And since this is an instant speed spell, you can easily use Zuko's Firebending ability to just cast this for 1 black mana. And whenever you cast the adventure part of the spell, it doesn't actually go to your graveyard, but you have to exile the card instead. Then for 4 mana, you can cast the creature part of this card, which will give you another Zuko trigger because you just cast something from exile. And on top of that, you get a really solid creature body, which is actually a 4/4 flying trample creature that will generate you a treasure token whenever it attacks. A perfect way to accelerate your mana and a huge creature body to start stacking counters on. Headliner Scarlet. Whenever this 4-mana haste creature enters the battlefield, you can pick one target opponent. And all creatures that opponent controls can't block until the end of the turn, which is just an excellent ability in this type of aggressive deck to just catch your opponents by surprise. And on top of that, at the beginning of our upkeep, Scarlet also allows us to impulse draw 1 card, both synergizing really well with the aggressive part of this deck and with the exile part of this deck. Iraxa, Empress of Mars. For 4 mana, you get a 5/4 body with trample and the battlecry mechanic, meaning whenever this creature attacks, every other attacking creature you control will get +1 power until the end of turn, which, as you can imagine, in this type of aggressive and token generating deck is actually a really big deal. And on top of that, whenever we cast a spell from anywhere other than our hand, we get to generate a 2/2 red warrior token. And since the entire point of this deck is actually casting things from exile, Iraxa will generate you a huge amount of tokens. She is both a creature token generator and a card that will buff up all of the tokens you generate. Rose, Cutthroat Raider. At the end of combat on your turn, you will get to generate 1 junk token for each opponent that you attacked. Junk tokens being small little artifacts that you can sacrifice to impulse draw 1 card. And if you are able to send one of your creatures at each one of your opponents, she will generate you 3 junk tokens, which you can just leave on the battlefield and use on any turn that you want to dig deeper into your library or you want to get more Zuko triggers with them. And whenever you do decide to crack a junk token with Rose on the battlefield, it will add 1 red mana to your mana pool, which you can then immediately use to cast any of the spells you just exiled with them. The Legend of Roku, a 4-mana saga that whenever it enters the battlefield allows you to exile the top 4 cards of your library and you are allowed to play them until the end of the next turn. Then whenever this card goes to its second stage, you get to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool, which you can use to just cast any of the exiled spells. And at its final stage, you get to exile this card and return it to the battlefield with its backside up. And a fun little fact, whenever this card does transform, it actually enters from exile and it will give you a Zuko trigger. And the backside of this card is a 4/4 creature with Firebending 4. And it is one of the best activated abilities to actually pump all of your Firebending mana into. For 8 generic mana on instant speed, you are able to generate a 4/4 flying dragon that also has Firebending 4. This card honestly can take over games all by itself, because the more dragons you will be able to generate, the more Firebending triggers you will get and you will be able to generate even more dragons. Now the main reason why this card is included in the deck is just the saga part. It already gives us some really good value. But I suppose the backside being a creature that has to be dealt with or it will win the game all by itself is a nice little added cherry on top. Wand of Wonder, one of my favorite little pet cards in the deck. For 4 mana and tapping this artifact, we get to roll a d20. Then every opponent will have to exile the top cards of their library until they hit an instant or sorcery card. Depending on the result of our die roll, we are able to cast any number of those spells for free. Rolling 1 to 9 will allow you to cast 1 spell, 10 to 19 will allow you to cast 2 spells, and rolling a natural 20 will allow you to cast all 3 of the exiled spells. Now, no matter what kind of instants or sorceries you actually hit with this spell, any number of spells you do decide to cast will give you Zuko triggers. And the results on this effect may really vary. You can hit small spells like a Farseek, a Path to Exile, a Brainstorm, which in itself is already some pretty okay value, but just imagine if you hit some expensive spells with this effect, like one of the Ultimatum cards, a Stormhurt, or even an Omniscience. Now in most decks the mana cost on this card really isn't worth it, because you have to pay 4 mana to play it and 4 mana to activate it. But since we will always have access to a huge amount of mana to use during combat thanks to Zuko's Firebending, it's actually really easy to use that mana to pay for the activated ability of this card. Dragonhawk, Fate's Tempest. I really love this card. Before Zuko actually got spoiled, I was really thinking about doing an exile-based Dragonhawk deck. For 5 mana, you get a 5/5 flying creature that whenever it enters the battlefield or it attacks, allows you to exile the top X cards of your library, X being the amount of creatures you control with power 4 or greater. You're then allowed to play those cards until the end of turn, and for every card you didn't cast this way, Dragonhawk will deal 2 damage to each opponent. And Dragonhawk is just the perfect fit for this deck. It will generate you value immediately the turn it comes down by exiling cards. It will keep generating you value over the next turns whenever you are able to attack with it. Due to the counter stacking of Zuko, we will always control a huge amount of creatures with 4 or greater power, and its burn ability will actually take huge chunks out of your opponent's life totals. And on top of having some fantastic abilities, just look at the art of this card. That alone is enough to include it in the deck. Blood-Soaked Insight. This 7 mana spell will have its cost reduced by 1 generic mana for each life your opponents lost this turn. And since we are an aggressive deck, in most cases you will be able to cast this spell for just 2 mana, which will make target opponent exile the top 3 cards of their library, and we are allowed to play those cards until the end of our next turn. A pretty good deal for just 2 mana. Now the main reason this card is included in the deck is because it is an MDFC land. If you don't need a spell, you can just play the backside of this card, which is a land that taps for either a red or a black mana. Like I mentioned in all my videos, there's really no reason to not play any of these MDFC lands in your decks. And the last card in this section is Shard Foyer and Warped Space. And this is one of the Duskmourn Room enchantment cards, meaning whenever this spell is in your hand, you can choose to play either side of the card. The other side of the card will be locked, but you are able to unlock it on sorcery speed by just playing the mana cost, so you actually have both effects active. The left part of this card is a 4 mana enchantment that will allow you to impulse draw at the beginning of your upkeep, functioning in exactly the same way as a Headliner Scarlet, just keep generating you value every single turn. And the right side of this card will enable you to cast 1 spell per turn from exile by paying 0 mana, which obviously in itself is a really bananas effect, and you can do some really funny things with this. During your turn, you can just cast any spell for free from exile, and then during an opponent's turn, if you still have any instant speed spells in exile available to cast, you can just cast it for free again, essentially allowing you to sort of bypass the once per turn mechanic. Alright, let's talk about Zuko's other half, the Firebending. These are the cards that will allow us to convert a huge amount of mana that Zuko will generate us into actual pressure, or they allow us to store the mana for later use, making sure not a single point of mana goes to waste. Secure the Wastes. For 1 white mana plus X, you get to generate X 1/1 white tokens. And since this is an instant speed spell, it is one of the best cards to actually use your Firebending mana for. Just leave one of your planes untapped, swing in with your huge power Zuko, cast a spell for like 6 mana, and you will get to generate 5 creature tokens. As you will see later in this video, we actually do play a ton of token generating cards in this deck, because those 1/1 tokens really do get out of control whenever you are able to cast a ton of spells from exile and stack a huge amount of +1/+1 counters on them. Commune with Lava. For 2 red mana plus X, you get to exile the top X cards of your library. And you will be able to cast them until the end of your next turn. And obviously the best part about this card is the fact that you can cast it on instant speed. So for example, if you do swing with your Zuko at 5 power, you will be able to exile the top 3 cards of your deck and you will have them available in your second main phase and during the remainder of your next turn. And that's just giving an example with an average power Zuko and without any other mana invested in it. In some games you will be able to use this card to dig 10 cards deep into your deck, and on your next turn you will be able to chain a ton of spells from exile, grow all of your creatures by a huge amount, and usually you will just be able to win the game at that point. Duelist's Flame. This spell will give target blocked creature you control plus X power and trample until the end of turn. And whenever that creature does deal combat damage to a player, you get to exile that many cards off the top of your library. Then you get to pick one non-land card of those cards and you get to cast it without paying its mana cost. So the amount of damage you actually deal with this effect only affects one thing, and that is how many cards you get to exile. Even if you only deal 1 combat damage and you exile a Dragonhawk for example, you will be able to cast it for free. Just keep in mind you will have to cast the exiled spell whenever this effect resolves. The timing effects on that card don't actually matter. And since this is an instant speed red spell, it is just perfect with Zuko's Firebending. Just swing with him and use the mana he generates to cast your Duelist's Flame, get a ton of commander damage through thanks to the power boost and the trample, and cast one of your biggest spells for absolutely free, which will give you another Zuko trigger. Electro Dominance. This instant speed spell will deal X damage to any target, and then you are able to cast any spell from your hand with mana value X or less for free. And this spell functions as an excellent removal spell to use the Firebending mana on. Just swing with your Zuko, and before even going to the blocker step, use the mana on an Electro Dominance, ping down any creature on the board that you don't like, and then get to cast any spell in your hand for free. By far one of the best synergistic cards with the Firebending mechanic. Go 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 go. Disciple of Ryusai. A 2-mana creature with 2 activated abilities. The first ability will allow you to give all creatures you control haste until the end of turn for just 1 mana. An excellent haste enabler to put even more pressure onto your opponents. And for 5 mana you get to create a 5/5 flying dragon creature token, but you can only use this ability if you control an attacking modified creature. Now as you can imagine, getting our creatures modified with a +1/+1 counters in this deck will never be a problem, and we will always be swinging. And this ability is just another excellent out for any amount of mana you are able to generate with Zuko's Firebending, generating you some huge flying tokens that you will be able to stack counters onto. Outrageous Robbery. For 2 black mana plus X, target opponent has to exile the top X cards of their library. And for as long as those cards stay in exile, you get the ability to cast them, and you can spend mana as though it was any color. Now at first I thought this was a horrible card, but then I realized it doesn't actually say until the end of turn. You will get the ability to cast the exiled cards for the remainder of the game. And the amount of value that this card will generate you can be absolutely crazy. Just keep 2 black mana open, swing with Zuko, use all of his Firebending mana to pump into this spell, and from now on you will always have a huge amount of cards in exile available to cast and to get some Zuko triggers with. Electro Assaulting Battery. This 3 mana creature really is a battery, because you won't lose any unspent red mana as steps or phases end. Meaning even after combat, if you don't have any instant speed spells to cast, you will just keep the red mana saved in Electro for later use. Or for example, you can also tap any mountains you control during an opponent's turn, and all the mana they produce will be stored in Electro, and you will have access to an insane amount of mana on your next turn. On top of that, whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, Electro will add 1 red mana to your mana pool. And since we do play a total of 21 instants and sorceries in this deck, this ability will actually generate you a huge amount of mana. And Electro doesn't only store mana, he actually also gives you an out for all the mana you store. Because whenever Electro leaves the battlefield, you get the ability to pay X generic mana. When you do, Electro will deal X damage to target player. And this really creates some sort of lose-lose situation for your opponents. Because if they allow Electro to stay on the battlefield, you will just take over the game by the amount of mana you are able to produce. And if they do decide to remove Electro, you will take a huge chunk out of their life total. And the last card in this section is a Hellkite Charger. A massive 6 mana flying haste creature with a really crazy ability. Whenever this creature attacks, you get the option to pay 7 mana. When you do, you get to untap all attacking creatures you control and you will get another combat step after this one. And this card can just win you the game on the spot if you do have a 7 power Zuko. Because you can just attack with all your creatures, Zuko will generate you 7 mana, you can then use this card's ability, untap everything, swing again, Zuko will generate you another 7 mana, untap everything again, and it will essentially give you infinite combat phases for as long as your creatures don't die in combat and you can keep generating 7 mana every time with Zuko. A really solid card to actually close out the game with if you are ahead on the board. Next up we have the Counter Synergies. Since Zuko will be handing out +1/+1 counters like candy, we might as well take full advantage of them. The cards in this section will turn all the counters into massive stat boosts, token production, or even more mana. As you will see, the counters that Zuko will generate you go way beyond just buffing your creatures in this deck. Dusk Legion Duelist, a 2 mana vigilance creature that whenever you put a +1/+1 counter on it will draw you a card. And to balance it out, this ability will only trigger once per turn. A really solid draw engine that will usually draw you 1 additional card per turn, and if you are able to cast some instant speed spells from exile during your opponent's turns, you will essentially be able to sort of bypass the once per turn mechanic. Runaway Steamkiln. Whenever we cast any red spell and this creature has fewer than 3 +1/+1 counters on it, we get to put 1 on it. And on instant speed, by removing 3 of those counters, we get to add 3 red mana to our mana pool. Now usually getting to the 3 counters on this creature does take a huge amount of spell casts and a huge amount of time. But the counters don't have to be generated by his own ability. Whenever you have both Zuko and this creature on the battlefield and you can start casting a few spells from exile, you will be able to stack counters onto this creature, remove those counters and cast even more from exile. Jacked Rabbit, a 2 mana creature that whenever it attacks will generate you rabbit tokens equal to its power. And obviously this type of card really double dips on Zuko's counter ability, because the more counters you are able to stack onto this creature, the more rabbits he will generate you. And then in turn, the more rabbits you do control, the more targets you actually have to put those +1/+1 counters onto. And it's really simple. Either your opponents deal with these token generators immediately, or they will just keep growing and generating you value and they will take over the game all by themselves. And this card also has the Ravenous mechanic, meaning you can invest more mana when you cast it and it will already enter with a huge amount of counters. Sadly, we can't cast this on instant speed and we can't use our Firebending mana for this. Anim Pakal, 1000 Moon. Whenever we attack with any non-gnome creature, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on Anim. Then we get to create X 1/1 colorless gnome creature tokens equal to the amount of counters that this card has on itself. And just like I talked about with the previous card, it really does double dip on Zuko's ability. You will stack additional counters on Anim, enabling you to generate even more gnome tokens, and you will be able to boost those little 1/1 gnomes into like 5/5 death machines. Krenko, Tin Street Kingpin, a card that functions in almost the exact same way as Anim Pakal. Whenever Krenko attacks, you get to put a counter on him, and then you get to create 1/1 goblin tokens equal to Krenko's power. A really solid card, but sadly it is a little worse than Anim Pakal, because you actually have to swing with Krenko himself to be able to generate those goblin tokens. Yatan Tomb Guard. Whenever any creature we control with any sort of counter on it deals combat damage to an opponent, we get to lose 1 life and we get to draw a card. And as you just saw with all of the token generating cards we are playing in this deck, and due to the way of how easy it is to get those +1/+1 counters thanks to Zuko, the amount of cards you will be drawing of this effect is just absolutely ridiculous. And we don't even have to jump through any hoops to get this huge amount of card draw, we just have to do what we're already doing in this deck anyways. Abzan Falconer. This little card will give every creature we control that has a +1/+1 counter on itself flying. Just the fact that you can give your entire buffed up token army evasion and almost guarantee they will connect for combat damage makes this into one of the best cards in the entire deck. Your opponents can feel totally safe behind their huge army of 1/1 chum block tokens. Just drop this creature and watch them scoop up their cards because they just lost the game. Crystalline Crawler, a 4 mana creature with the Converge mechanic, meaning it will enter with 1 +1/+1 counter for each color of mana you spend on this. Now since we are a 3 color deck, most of the time this card will enter with 3 counters on itself. And on instant speed you can remove a counter from this creature to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. Now that in itself is already really solid, but just keep in mind you will also be able to put a huge amount of counters on this card by using Zuko's ability. It also does a ton of work in helping us with our color fixing. And even whenever you don't have Zuko on the battlefield, you can just step this creature at a +1/+1 counter on itself and you will essentially net 1 mana every single turn. Iro, Dragon of the West. For 4 mana you get a haste body with the mentor mechanic, meaning whenever this creature attacks together with a creature with lesser power, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on that smaller creature. Not the most relevant of abilities, but a pretty nice way to stack additional counters on everything you play in this deck. The real kicker is Iro's last ability. At the beginning of combat on your turn, every creature with a +1/+1 counter on it will get Firebending 2. And this ability is absolutely beyond broken in this deck. Because as you know by now, we will always be controlling a huge amount of creature tokens that will all be buffed up by +1/+1 counters thanks to Zuko. Then giving them Firebending 2 and turning your creature sideways will generate you somewhere between 10 to 20 red mana, which if you then dump into one of our huge X spells will just win you the game on the spot. Sephiroth, Fallen Hero. Whenever this creature attacks, we get to put a cell counter onto another target creature. Now the cell counter doesn't actually do anything, but it does make a creature modified. And Sephiroth will change the base stats of any modified creature to 7/5, which obviously is a really huge stat line. And since Sephiroth changes base stats, you don't actually lose any value of your +1/+1 counters. Now while I do agree that Sephiroth is some sort of a win more card, he is a really good win more card. Because the amount of power he will give to your entire board if you have like 10 creatures with counters on them is just beyond ridiculous. And what I like most about Sephiroth is the fact that he is actually really hard to get rid of. Because for 3 generic mana you can sacrifice any modified creature you control and Sephiroth will just return from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. Just sacrifice one of your small creature tokens and you will get access to one of the best win cons in the deck again. If your opponents aren't able to exile Sephiroth, he will just keep coming back and eventually they will run out of removal and out of life. If you're enjoying these in-depth deck tech videos and you want to support me and the channel, check out the YouTube membership program. All members will get early access to the deck lists of these videos before they even go live, custom Panzer emojis you can use anywhere on Discord and YouTube, and access to some members only channels on the Discord server, where I'm always sharing behind the scenes stuff, projects that I'm working on, and occasionally I'm also asking for feedback on any of the decks that I'm brewing. And speaking of the Discord server, if you're not in there yet, definitely come and join us. We have one of the most active and fast growing Magic communities out there right now. People are sharing their deck lists, helping each other brew their decks, and honestly it's just a really cool place to hang out with like-minded Magic players. I also want to give a special shout out to Mishkin and Devin Dragon. These two people are by far the most competent deck builders that I've ever met, and they helped me a ton with getting this Zuko list together. This deck really wouldn't be the same without all of their help. And a huge thanks to all the current YouTube members. Thanks to you, I can keep doing what I love doing most, making some awesome weekly in-depth deck decks. If you want to support the channel or join the Discord, the links are in the description below. Next up, we have the acceleration section. If you do want to get Zuko out as early as possible and have the mana available to just keep chaining spells from exile, we do need a solid ramp package. As you will see, we are playing some really simple and solid mana rocks, but we are also playing a few unique options. Sol Ring. Yeah, obvious inclusion, it is the best mana rock ever printed. Even though it doesn't help us get Zuko out any earlier because it doesn't have any generic mana in its mana cost, we will always have a use for the 2 colorless mana it produces us. We also play 4 2-mana mana rocks in this deck, an Arcane Signet and 3 of the Talismans. Since we are a 3-color budget deck, they do really help us a ton with fixing our colors. And the extra mana these cards will generate us will allow us to cast multiple spells in a single turn from exile and get multiple Zuko triggers. Professional Facebreaker. Whenever one or more creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, you get to generate a treasure token. And in this type of aggressive deck where you will always be swinging with all of your creatures, the amount of treasures this card will generate you is absolutely insane. Just be warned, since this card says 1 or more creatures, even if you control connect with 5 creatures on one single opponent, you will only get 1 treasure token. Usually the best thing to do is just send one of your creatures at each one of your opponents and you will get 1 treasure token for each opponent that was dealt damage this turn. Now that ability in itself would already be more than enough to include this card in the deck. But on top of that, we can also sacrifice treasure tokens to this card to actually impulse draw, allowing us to dig way deeper into our deck and enabling us to get Zuko triggers. Interdimensional Web Watch. Whenever this 4 mana artifact enters the battlefield, we get to exile the top 2 cards of our library and we are allowed to cast them until the end of our next turn. We can also tap this artifact to add 2 mana in any color combination to our mana pool, but we can only use that mana to cast spells from exile, which is something that we will always be able to do. In my experience, whenever you play this card and exile the top 2, you are usually instantly able to tap this card, get the 2 mana and instantly cast one of the spells you just exiled, which will generate you some really solid tempo. Next up, we have the support cards. These are all the cards that didn't really fit into any other category, but they really improve how the deck plays. Great Train Heist. A 1 mana spell with the spree mechanic, meaning whenever we cast this, we can pay additional mana to choose any of its modes. For 3 additional mana, we get to untap all creatures we control and we get an additional combat phase after this one. For 2 additional mana, all creatures we control will get +1 power and first strike until the end of turn. And for 1 additional red mana, we get to choose target opponent, and whenever one of our creatures deals combat damage to that player, we get to generate a tapped treasure token. And honestly, all of the abilities on this card are just crazy. Either allows you to deal a huge amount of damage with the extra combat and get even more mana from Firebending, gives a power boost to all of your creatures, allowing you to deal extra damage, and thanks to the first strike, you will never lose them in combat. And the last ability can potentially generate you a huge amount of treasure tokens. And the best part about this card is that you can cast it on instant speed, so you can use the mana Zuko produces you with his Firebending to pay for any of these modes. Hopeful Initiate. For 3 mana and removing 2 +1/+1 counters from amongst creatures we control, we get to destroy target artifact or enchantment. And with the amount of counters that we will be able to generate thanks to Zuko, this is just a repeatable removal engine. One of the best ways to deal with any problematic enchantments or artifacts your opponents might control. And this creature also has a way to stack counters on itself because it has the training mechanic. Whenever it attacks together with a creature with greater power, it will put a +1/+1 counter on itself. Reconnaissance. A 1 mana enchantment with an activated ability for 0 mana. On instant speed, we get to remove target attacking creature from combat and we get to untap it. Now this effect might sound really weird, but just hear me out. There will be some cases where you really want to be swinging with Zuko to get that Firebending mana, but all of your opponents will just have some death touch or some huge creature blockers. Thanks to Reconnaissance, you can just swing with Zuko, get the Firebending trigger, remove him from combat, and you won't lose him. And Reconnaissance also gives all of your creatures some sort of pseudo-vigilance. You can just swing with all of your creatures, deal combat damage, and at the end of the combat damage steps, you can just remove them from combat, untap them, and you will be able to use them as blockers. One of the best enchantment cards ever printed. Legion Leadership. For 2 mana on instant speed, we get to double target creature's power. A really fun card to use on Zuko before you swing with him to just get double the amount of damage and double the amount of mana from his Firebending. And since this is an MDFC card, if you don't need the spell, just play the backside, which is a land that will tap for either a white or a red mana. You should really view these MDFC cards as land cards that might have a nice little benefit later in the game. Sundering Eruption. For 3 mana, you get to destroy target land. The controller of that land will get to search their library for any basic land card and put it into play tapped. I suppose this is a really nice way to deal with a Cabal Coffers or a Field of the Dead, for example, but the main reason why this card is included in the deck is because of the last little part of its ability. Creatures without flying can't block this turn. If your opponents don't control any flying creatures, you get a spell that reads pay 3 mana, all your creatures are unblockable. And in this type of aggressive deck, this effect is usually more than enough to just take an opponent out of the game. And once again, if you don't need the spell, just play the backside, which is a land that taps for red mana, and you can even make it enter untapped for the low cost of 3 life. War Leader Skull. This enchantment has an anthem effect attached to it that will give all creatures you control +1/+1, which is a fantastic way to just boost up the power and toughness of all of your tokens and to get 1 additional mana from the firebending that Zuko has. And whenever a creature would enter the battlefield under our control, this enchantment will deal 1 damage to each opponent. Now we're not some sort of a group slug deck by any means, but with the amount of tokens that we will be generating in this deck, this card will actually deal a huge amount of damage over the course of the game. Just imagine swinging with your 7 power Jacked Rabbit. You will get to generate 7 1/1 rabbit tokens and you will get to deal a total of 21 damage to your opponents, which is pretty crazy. And it also gives you some sort of an alternate win for whenever you can't win by using combat damage. If an opponent has a ghostly prison on the battlefield, for example. Gogo, Mysterious Mime. At the beginning of combat on our turn, we get to pick one of our other creatures and Gogo will turn into a non-legendary copy of that. And this ability means that we can use Gogo to double up on the value of any legendary creature we play in the deck. Get another copy of Zuko, doubling up on your counter production and firebending. Get another copy of Dragonhawk. Get another copy of Anim Bakal, generating you even more Gnome tokens. Or even copy your Avatar Goku if you did manage to flip the saga. And Gogo doesn't stop there, because at the beginning of combat he will also give himself and the copied creature +2 power and haste until the end of turn, acting as a great haste enabler for any creature you just played and enabling Gogo to just swing on the turn he comes down and start generating you value. And the +2 power boost is actually pretty relevant to boost Zuko's power and get even more mana from his firebending. Next up we have the protection and interaction section. Since Zuko is really core to our entire game plan and we do want a huge board of creatures to actually benefit from his counters, playing ways to protect our board state is absolutely crucial in this deck. The cards in this section will cover how we keep Zuko and our board filled with creatures alive and how we do interact with opposing threats. Since we are in Mardu colors, we do have access to some of the best removal spells in Commander. Swords to Plowshares. For 1 mana, on instant speed, you get to exile any target creature and the owner of that creature will gain life equal to its power. Yeah, removal spells really don't get any more efficient than this one. You will be able to deal with any problematic creature on the board on instant speed and in return they will just get a really small amount of life. Bulwark Ox, a 2 mana creature with the Saddle 1 mechanic, meaning before combat you get the option to tap any creature with 1 power and this creature will get saddled. Whenever it then attacks, you will be able to put a free +1/+1 counter on any target creature. And on instant speed you can sacrifice this creature to give any other creature you control with a counter on it indestructible and hexproof until the end of turn. Since all the creatures we control will always have +1/+1 counters thanks to Zuko, this card is just an excellent way to protect either Zuko or any of our value pieces from any sort of board wipe or spot removal. Grand Crescendo. For 2 white mana +X on instant speed, we get to generate X 1/1 tokens. And then all creatures we control will gain indestructible until the end of turn. And you can use this card both offensively and defensively. You can use it as a 2 mana spell whenever an opponent is casting a spot removal spell or a board wipe to protect your creatures. Or whenever you are going for a swing with Zuko, you can use it as a more expensive Secure the Waste and use it as an actual token generator by using Zuko's mana. Legion's Initiative. A 2 mana enchantment that will give all red creatures you control +1 power and all white creatures you control +1 toughness. Pretty nice little stat boost, but the main reason this card is in the deck is its activated ability. For 2 mana and exiling this card, you get to exile all creatures you control. At the beginning of the next combat step, your creatures will all return to the battlefield and they will all gain haste. And it's a really versatile card you can use in many ways. If an opponent is playing a board wipe, you can just exile all your creatures, the board wipe will resolve, and then your creatures will just return to the battlefield, making sure nothing is lost. You can use this spell during your own first main phase to exile all your creatures. Combat will begin, they will return, and they will now all have haste and you will instantly be able to swing with them. Probably the most impactful thing about this card is that all your creatures will re-enter the battlefield from exile. If you, for example, exile your Zuko and 4 other creatures, they will all re-enter at the same time. Zuko will see himself and all the other creatures entering. You will get 5 Zuko triggers. So all of your creatures will instantly re-enter the battlefield with 5 additional +1/+1 counters on them. The last Agni Kai. For 2 mana, you can make target creature you control fight target creature you don't control. Already acting as a really solid interaction spell to just pinpoint remove any of your opponent's valuable creatures. And if you did manage to deal excess damage to the creature your opponent controlled, you get to add that much red mana to your mana pool. And that mana won't empty from your pool until the end of turn. So even if you do decide to cast this spell during your combat step, the mana will still be available to use during your second main phase to cast anything. And since all of our creatures will always have a really huge stat line thanks to Zuko's counters, we will be able to remove anything with this or generate a huge amount of mana. Anguished Unmaking. For 3 mana, 3 life, you get to exile target permanent on instant speed. One of the most efficient removal spells that basically allows you to deal with anything. Eerie Interlude. For 3 mana, we get to exile any number of creatures we control. Then at the beginning of the next end step, those creatures will return to the battlefield. Pretty similar to Legion's Initiative, a way to protect all our creatures from a board wipe, but it does have a couple small differences. We get to pick any number of creatures we control. It doesn't actually exile all our creatures, which is actually a good thing because it won't exile any of our tokens. Because whenever you exile a token, it ceases to exist. It will never return. Instead, we can just pick any creature that is being targeted by a negative effect and just blink those and not anything else. And just like I explained earlier, whenever you do decide to blink 3 creatures, Zuko will see all 3 of those creatures re-enter the battlefield and you will be able to put 3 counters on every creature you control. Will of the Mardu. Whenever we cast a spell, we get to choose one out of 2 options. First option allows us to create a 1/1 warrior token for every creature that target player controls, just giving us a way to swarm the board with even more tokens to start stacking counters onto or to trigger cards like War Leader's Call. And the second option allows us to ping damage to any creature on the board equal to the amount of creatures we control, acting as a really solid removal spell because we will always be controlling a huge amount of creatures. And the best part about this card is whenever Zuko is on the battlefield, we actually get to pick both options, both dealing with a problematic creature on the battlefield and spawning us a gazillion tokens. Hurl Through Hell. For 4 mana, we get to exile target creature. Then until the end of our next turn, we are able to cast that exiled creature. Now honestly, this isn't the most efficient removal spell. That being said, it is a really nice way to use Zuko's Firebending mana, because you can just attack with Zuko and usually you will be able to cast this spell for just a low cost of 1 black mana, removing a really valuable creature on the board, and on your next turn you will just be able to cast that creature for yourself and even get a Zuko trigger from it. This really is one of my favorite pet cards that I really had to include in this deck. And the last card in this section is Damning Verdict, a 5 mana board wipe that will destroy all creatures with no counters on them. And as you can imagine, in this type of deck, this will always function as a one-sided board wipe because our creatures will always have counters on them, allowing us to just set our opponents back into the Stone Age, reset their entire board, and on top of that, they won't have any blockers left and you will be able to go for a huge swing and deal a huge amount of damage. Next up, we have the lands. Since this is a 100 euro budget deck, the mana base isn't anything fancy. If you do want to upgrade this deck, the mana base is the perfect place to start. You can include shock lands, fetch lands, bond lands, a triome. All of those lands aren't needed by any means, but they will make the deck run a lot smoother. We're also running a couple of utility lands, so I'll start by going over those first. Castle Embered. For 3 mana and tapping this land, all creatures you control will get +1 power until the end of turn. Now in most decks, this effect will cost you 4 mana, because you have to tap this land and 3 other lands. But Zuko's Firebending ability is actually a really great way to activate some of the abilities on your lands. Just swing with Zuko, generate 3 mana in the process, and then you just have to tap this land to give all of your creatures a power boost, which can actually result in a huge amount of damage, especially thanks to all the token generators we are playing in this deck. Kori Mountain Monastery. For 4 mana and tapping this land, we get to exile the top card of our library and we get the ability to play it until the end of our next turn. An additional way on a land to get more cards into exile and get even more Zuko triggers. And once again, the efficiency of this card gets absolutely out of control if you do use Zuko's Firebending ability to pay for the cost. Spine Rock Null. Whenever this land enters the battlefield, you have to exile the top 5 cards of your library. Then you exile one of those cards for later use with this land's activated ability. For 1 red mana and tapping this land, you get to cast the exiled card for free. But you can only activate this effect if an opponent lost 7 or more life this turn. And the damage doesn't even have to come from us. If your opponents are just swinging at each other and someone takes 7 damage, you can just activate this card and get a free cast from exile, which will give you a Zuko trigger. And you can get some insane value from this effect. Just imagine exiling a really expensive spell like a Dragonhawk or a Sephiroth and being able to cast it for just 1 mana. Vault of the Archangel. For 4 mana and tapping it, we get the ability to give all of our creatures Death Touch and Lifelink until the end of turn. Now usually the Death Touch isn't all that relevant in this deck because our creatures will always have a huge amount of power, but the lifelink can be really crazy. Just imagine swinging with like 10 buffed up 5/5 tokens, activating this card, and you will be able to lifelink 50 life in the process, which will make it really hard for your opponents to take you out of the game. And another land we play with the hideaway mechanic is Windbrisk Heights. When it enters, you get to exile the top 4, pick one of those cards, and for 1 white mana and tapping this land, you get to cast that exiled card for free. But you can only activate this ability if you attacked with 3 or more creatures this turn. And as you know by now, we will always be swinging in this deck, so it's actually really easy to meet this requirement. And for the normal mana producing lands in this deck, we play 3 Pain lands, 3 Check lands, 3 Fast lands, 3 Scry lands, 2 Filter lands, 1 of the Horizon lands, a Command Tower, a Nomad Outpost, an Exotic Orchard, and for basics we play 4 mountains, 2 plains, and 2 swamps. And finally, for everyone that wants to push this deck even further and doesn't care about the €100 budget, I've also included a full upgrade section. These are the cards that will absolutely supercharge the deck. More efficient protection, better acceleration, and some Mardu staple cards that will push Zuko from a cute budget deck to a really strong powerhouse. At the end of the section, I will also be showing what cards to cut from the deck to actually replace with these upgrades. Esper Sentinel, probably the strongest white creature ever printed. Whenever any opponent casts their first non-creature spell in a turn, they have to pay X mana. X being Esper Sentinel's power. If they don't, we get to draw a card. And the amount of cards that Esper Sentinel will draw you whenever you are able to drop this card on turn 1 is absolutely crazy. Usually it will draw you between 2 to 3 cards per turn cycle. Now in most decks, an Esper Sentinel is always a fantastic inclusion, but especially in the Zuko deck where we will be able to stack counters on it and actually grow its power, your opponents will never ever be paying the additional mana cost and you will just be able to keep your hand filled throughout the entire game. Ragavan, Nimble Pilferer. For 1 mana you get a monkey pirate that whenever he deals combat damage to an opponent, that opponent has to exile the top card of their library. And we get the ability to cast the exiled card until the end of our turn. And on top of that, Ragavan will also generate us a treasure token whenever we connect with him. Now this card is pretty self-explanatory. It's a really simple 1-drop body that will give you access to 2 really vital things. He will start accelerating your mana from as early as turn 2, and he will give you access to a ton of cards to cast from exile to actually get Zuko triggers with. Charismatic Conqueror. Whenever any artifact or creature enters the battlefield under an opponent's control, they get to make a decision. They get the option to either tap that permanent, and if they don't, we get to generate a 1/1 vampire token with lifelink. And this is a really oppressive effect. If you're playing against a treasure player, all of their treasures will now enter tapped and they won't be able to instantly use them. Playing against a combo player that's about to make infinite 1/1 haste tokens to just win the game, those tokens will now enter tapped. Playing against some weird shenanigans like a Hullbreaker Horror and a Soul Ring, they now won't be able to do the combo. Now actually everyone can make those things untapped, but we will get a huge army of 1/1 lifelink vampires in the process. And once you are able to start buffing up these vampire tokens with the counters of Zuko, things get absolutely crazy. This card would make such a fine addition to the main deck, but sadly it is a really expensive card. Loto, Corrupt Sheriff. Whenever any player casts their second spell in any given turn, you get to generate a treasure token. Usually whenever you are able to resolve a Loto on turn 2, by the time it's your turn again, you will already have generated like 1 to 2 treasure tokens, and he will keep generating you a huge amount of value over the course of the game. And Loto doesn't only triggers off your opponent's casting spells. Whenever you cast 2 spells in a turn, you also get to generate a treasure token, which by the way enters untapped and will instantly be able to use and produce you mana. Aggravated Assault. For 5 mana, you get to untap all creatures you control, and you will get an additional combat phase after this one. And this card is just a straight upgrade to Hellkite Charger, because whenever you now have a 5 power Zuko, you can just swing with him, use the Firebending mana to untap him, get another combat phase, swing again, and you will essentially get infinite combat phases for as long as you can keep generating the 5 mana with the Firebending. This enchantment is one of the most broken cards with the new Firebending mechanic. Birgi, God of Storytelling. For 3 mana, you get a creature that will add 1 red mana to your mana pool whenever you cast any spell. And any amount of mana that you generate by using Birgi's ability will be stored for as long as you control Birgi. A really excellent way to generate a huge amount of mana and just accelerate you like crazy. Now in most decks, Birgi is included for the front side of the card, but she actually has a really crazy backside, which is just the perfect fit for this deck. It's a legendary artifact that allows you to discard a card to impulse draw the top 2 cards of your library, which is just one of the best late game effects to just ditch any cards in your hand, dig really deep into your library, and enable you to get a huge amount of Zuko triggers. Both sides of this card are just fantastic for what we're trying to do in this deck. Delayed Blast Fireball. A 3 mana instant speed spell that will deal 2 damage to each opponent and each creature they control. But if this spell was cast from exile, it deals 5 damage instead. And this card also has the Foretell mechanic, meaning we can just exile it for 2 mana and then cast it for 6 mana from exile later on. And whenever we do, it is just a really crazy one-sided board wipe effect. You will get to wipe all of your opponent's creatures, and you will get to chunk a huge amount of damage out of their life totals. Now a really cool thing about Delayed Blast Fireball is that you can even cast it from exile in this deck without even using its Foretell mechanic. You can just play an Impulse card draw effect, exile this card, cast it from exile for 3 mana, and you will get to deal 5 damage to everything, which is some absolutely ridiculous value. Flawless Maneuver. For 3 mana on instant speed, you get to give all creatures you control indestructible. But whenever you control your commander, you are actually able to cast this spell without paying its mana cost. As I mentioned in the main part of the video, board wipes are the biggest enemy of this deck. And since we will control Zuko 99% of the time, just getting a 0 mana spell we can use to actually save all of our creatures is just crazy good value. Prosper Tomebound. If you really want to build a deck that goes all in on casting things from exile, Prosper is by far the best commander to do so, because he has a really solid exile engine. At the beginning of your end step, he will just exile a card and you are able to play it until the end of your next turn. And whenever you do cast a spell from exile, you get to generate a treasure token. And that last effect is just absolutely broken, because it does allow you to just keep chaining spells from exile and get you an insane amount of Zuko triggers. If you do want to upgrade this deck without buying the entire upgrade section, I'd really recommend you just getting a Prosper. It is by far the best upgrade for the deck. Bonehorde Dracosaur. A 5 mana creature that will impulse draw 2 cards at the beginning of your upkeep. If you exile a land this way, you get to create a 3/1 red dinosaur token. And if you exiled a non-land card this way, you also get to generate a treasure token. A really massive creature body that will give you access to even more mana, and that also acts as a fantastic token producer. And whenever you hit both a non-land card and a land card, he will actually do both of his triggers, and you will get a crazy amount of value. And the last card in this section is Uncivil Unrest, a 5 mana enchantment that will give all creatures you control the riot mechanic, meaning whenever they enter the battlefield, you either get to put a +1/+1 counter on them, or they will get haste. Both options being fantastic in this deck, and it will depend on the board state what option you actually choose. But the main reason this card is included in the deck is its last passive ability. If a creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it would deal combat damage to a permanent or a player, it will deal double damage instead. This card will essentially double all the damage output we already have in this deck. Just getting 1 Zuko trigger and getting a +1/+1 counter on your entire board will give all of your creatures some sort of pseudo double strike. And that's it for my in-depth deck tech on Fire Lord Lord Zuko. A low curve, very explosive Mardu deck that will turn every cast from exile, every blink effect, and every attack into one giant snowball of mana and counters. This deck feels really fast, really synergistic, and once the engine starts rolling, it really feels like one of the most fun decks I've played in a while, especially on a €100 budget. If you enjoyed the video, drop a flame emoji in the comments below so I know you made it all the way to the end. Hit the like button, hit subscribe, and hit the bell notification icon so you don't miss next week's video. And if you really want to take firebending to the max and you want the full Firelord experience, don't forget to check out my Ozai deck as well. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.